Good evening, and thanks for joining tonight's TI Technology webinar hosted by Texas Instruments, where tonight we're going to take a look at the third part of a three-part webinar series focused on grant writing. Tonight we're going to focus on developing a budget for a grant proposal. If you happen to miss the first two parts, no worries at all. We'll show you a little bit later how you can access those first two parts for free, download the materials, etc. And I don't think it's going to affect, if you're just joining us for part three, I think you'll still be able to go back and look at parts 1 and 2 just fine. My name is Mike Houston, and I'm the moderator for this event. I teach algebra and calculus near Pittsburgh, where I use TI technology to make tough-to-teach, tough-to-learn concepts accessible to all my students. Tonight, I'm joined by two fantastic people, Jen Cesar and Doris Teague. Jen is a grant partnership consultant for Texas Instruments. Before coming to TI, she taught middle grades math and science for Carlton Farmers Branch ISD. Jen also taught science, health, and special ed for Grants Cibola County Schools. Jen was the curriculum development manager for the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, where she and her team created the content used in the Space Camp and Aviation Challenge programs, as well as unique learning experiences at the Space and Rocket Center Museum. Jen, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm so glad to see everybody joining us tonight, and we hope that you get a lot out of today's session. And feel free to contact us if you need assistance after the session.
And Doris has experience in the development and implementation of Gear Up programs in Texas, past experience as a teacher, supervisor, project coordinator, grant writer, and trainer. She is currently consulting with 5 Gear Up partnerships and serves as a grants outreach consultant with Texas Instruments. Experience at local, state, and national venues, including the National Center for Community and Educational Partnerships, gives Doris a broad knowledge of education initiatives and practices. Doris, we're so happy to have you with us tonight.
This is the third part of our little mini-series.
We're expecting a large crowd, so your audio is muted. Feel free at any time to send any questions you have to Doris or Jenny using the Q&A window on the right side of your screen. We'll also be using the chat window to send general messages. As a reminder, the session is being recorded, and we'll provide a link to the event certificate of attendance as well as a link for the documents that are being used tonight by Jenny and Doris at the conclusion of the webinar. We hope you don't have any audio issues, but if you do, try selecting Communicate in the WebEx menu and choose Audio Broadcast. If that doesn't fix your audio issues, in the participant window where your name is located, there's an icon that looks like a phone headset. By clicking that icon, you'll receive call-in information, and you'll be able to change your audio from the audio broadcast to calling in using a phone, and that should alleviate any further audio issues. At this point, Doris is going to discuss our agenda.
I am. Thank you. Tonight we're going to talk about the idea of the way that when you write a grant, you develop your goals and objectives, and then the budget needs to obviously match those. But before we get to that, we'll go over a few vocabulary words that deal with budgets. And they'll use those periodically in grant proposals, and so I want you just to have just a kind of working knowledge of what those are and what you would be asked to create. And we'll look at a sample budget. It's a really simple budget, but it gives us an idea of how you have to rationalize the costs that are in a budget. We have all of the materials, the PowerPoint and the sample budget are located in the Dropbox location that you see there. I know it's long, I know it's lots to look at, but if you click on it, it will take you also to part 1, part 2, and then the items for tonight's presentation. And then we have a link there for TI products and professional development. And a really good thing about this is that we're going to have 2 winners tonight who have a chance to attend the conference coming up in March in San Antonio for TQ.
Thanks so much, Doris. And Jen is going to discuss our expected outcomes.
So at the end of today's session, you should be able to describe the typical budget development ideas, all the different things that go into it, be familiar with the terminology used when they talk about different parts of a budget, and the different types of financial documentation required for your grant proposal. You'll also be able to take a sample typical budget and be able to explain the reasons for the various expenditures in its key areas.
Thanks, Jen. Doris, you have control, and feel free to share your screen.
Okay. I'm going to click over to the PowerPoint. And as I said, this is the 3rd part of our little series on developing budgets. This is great for people who are new to for writing grants. It's great for people who are new to writing grants. And those of you who are experienced will also have a good little reminder of all of the ins and outs of writing those grants. This is who you're talking to Doris and to Jennifer, and here's the Dropbox location. This is all in the PowerPoint for you, so we hope you'll access those materials. And then that brings us to this very important idea about a budget for any grant that you write. When you first look at a grant proposal, you know, you're going to be really excited about the ideas that you have, the things you want to do, and you think, oh, I just need some money for that, or we have some money, but we need more money, or we need to expand to other grade levels, or we need more equipment. And so I just want to remind you that all of that is so important, that motivation and the excitement. And everything that you want to do in your grant, you're going to need to think later, what's it going to cost to do this? And how am I going to explain to the funding agents, to whoever's giving the money for the grant, why we need those amounts in the budget? So this quote is really important, that your budget has to tell the funder instantly if you know what you're doing in your grant proposal. So I want to talk about the idea that you're going to develop some goals and objectives for your budget, for your grant, and it has to relate to the budget. I keep saying those back and forth, but they also interrelate. So your goal is your really big, overarching, your destination of what you really intend to do. For example, our target is we really want to increase participation in an after-school tutoring program by 50% in 1 year. So this happens all the time. You know, we offer programs and especially in after-school programs, I have people say lots of times, we have a great program, but the kids aren't coming. And there's several reasons for that, but also, you know, that's something that we really want to get the most participation in a program that we're offering that we feel we've invested time and money and energy in. And so we're going to say I'm going to pretend this is the big overarching goal for a grant that you've looked into and you want to offer. So that's going to be our goal. And then I'm going to look at next some of the objectives for that'll tell us how close or how realistic or what we're going to do when we are going to be aiming for that goal. So one of the objectives that I've written is related to that after-school program where we want to increase that participation. And so I've written an objective that says, and remember, this is not a grant that's out there. I took one, you know, I just wanted to give you an example, but there are possibly some pretty interesting things along these lines out there. In this case is we want to add add something called Einstein's Pups. It's some companion dogs that come to schools, and they visit classrooms, and kids love to be around them, and they you know, a lot of times they can just take the stress away from everything related to reading or math or whatever it is. And so we're going to add this Einstein's Pups program 3 days a week to this after-school tutoring program. And we hope that that's going to increase this program by 50% during this school year. So that objective is important, but the more important thing about it is that remember these little clues. It's a SMART objective. It's very specific as to what we want to do. It's measurable. We can get data back to tell, you know, what's working, what isn't working. It is attainable. It is realistic, and it's time-bound. So we know what we want to accomplish, and that's really in any grant proposal or any grant that you write, these objectives are going to be your guidepost for where you're going. And because I want to be sure about those objectives, later on in the budget, I'm going to explain what how those expenditures will help us to meet that goal and those objectives. So this is where we get into a little bit about vocabulary, budget vocabulary 101. And trust me, it can get very complicated, but when it gets very complicated is when you start calling in the business office and the other people in the district that you think, oh my gosh, they're going to have to explain this more about this, because some budgets, if you write a very, very large grant, can have you develop a budget for, if it's a 5-year or 6 or 7-year grant, they're going to have you develop a budget for each of those years. So it does get complicated. But for our purposes, in this particular webinar, we're going to stick with some pretty basic information, but it's information you will see repeatedly called for in grants. So your detailed budget should be very clear and organized and easy to understand. And they're going to ask you usually in a grant proposal. One of the things they'll ask for is they will have a list of budget categories. They will have categories like direct or indirect costs. They will have categories like contracted services. Are you going to contract with anyone to help you manage this grant or be a part of this grant? They're going to ask for all of those, possibly all of those categories. Sometimes you will luck out in a grant, and a lot of times if you're writing a grant that's a foundation-funded grant, then they will just ask you for like a cost analysis sheet. They will just ask you to list the expenses, and predict how much you think each will cost, and they'll ask you for a total at the end. But in federal budgets, in state budgets, they will ask for budget worksheets, and these are some of the things we'll be talking about in the next few slides. Okay, so one of the things they're going to, and I'm literally giving you the information of what you'll find in these budget worksheets. They will ask you for something called direct costs. And these are the items that basically I say this is what you want the grant to mostly pay for. And these are the real high dollar or big items that you're hoping to fund. Well, remember, I'm going to be working on that little sample grant that I talked about. We want to increase that after-school program. We're going to bring in these trainers and their dogs that work with them, and that we're going to have them come to classroom, to those after-school tutoring sessions. And, you know, they will have very distinct roles that they'll do. They will, you know, have rules and regulations and all, but they will have to be paid for. You will have to have time to pay for the salaries of those people that are coming. And so one of the items under direct costs is salaries. Who is going to be paid from the grant funds? And these are the questions you have to start asking yourself. Are there going to be, how many employees do we think we're going to be paying out of this grant? Are we going to have to hire some people? And what would be the cost of that? Is there going to be a project coordinator or director? Some grants will ask you even for the percentages of those employees. Are they going to be full or part-time employees? Are there going to be, what wages will they be paid? And if you have one of those really large grants that's over a period of several years, those wages have to be built in case there's any raises or increases in their salaries that come along. So it gets kind of complicated. For our purposes today, we're just going to talk about the possibility of some part-time personnel in this grant. And they will also ask you in direct costs what kind of fringe benefits, are you going to pay insurance for the personnel? Are there other things that the district or the institution is going to offer that are fringe benefits? And those have to be built in too. Another type of direct cost that you would see in a budget is travel. You'll have to know in advance as much as possible where these employees are going to be going. Are they going to be traveling to and from the schools, and how often and how far is it? Are there other locations they would be traveling to? And you just kind of have to predict what that mileage amount will be and what it would cost on a daily and even weekly basis, and then you project that over to the life of the grant, or the 1 year at least in the grant. You have to know if there are any required meetings or conferences. A lot of federal grants will require employees to travel to Washington, D.C. or other locations to attend meetings that are put on by the U.S. Department of Ed or other groups. And so you have to build in to your grant the cost of that transportation, the lodging, the meals, if there's any registration fees. And so right away, you can see when you take salaries and you take travel into account in a grant budget, those are going to be some pretty high costs there. So you're always in the mode of looking at, how many employees, how much travel, how much expense a budget will allow, a grant will allow. And then you have to find out what is considered allowable travel. That means suppose you do write a federal or a state grant, you have to find out whether it is allowable that employees can travel out of the state. And they sometimes have to get permission from the program officer to do that. These are all considerations. I know it sounds complicated, but once you get into it, every budget, every proposal will have a budget sheet that will tell you all of these things. It will say the kinds of expenses that are allowable, the kinds that are not allowable, the kinds of conferences and things that people should go to. So it looks complicated, but it's spelled out usually in your descriptions of your grants.
Doris, can I add in on that?
Sure, Jen.
I know that if you're looking at the personnel part and you're thinking, oh, well, we'll just get volunteers, you also want to remember that the volunteers that you have for those different things, even if you exclude the travel portion, if they're a volunteer, whatever their salary would be per hour is an in-kind match that you would want to include in your budget. And we'll hit some of that later, but that's going to be that external income that's coming into the grant. And it's the same way that you calculate salaries for actual grant employees, you would do the same for your volunteers.
That's a good point, absolutely. And some grants will ask you for those additional in-kind contributions, and then in some cases that won't be a factor. For direct costs, allergy season. Also for direct costs, there will be a line item or a category for equipment. What equipment will be required for the grant? And many of you are probably interested in technology grants where equipment is absolutely necessary. So you'll want to be sure that you have done, your research on how much that equipment will cost. You need to think about things like storage for the equipment. Where's it going to be kept? And suppose you get handhelds, or suppose you get, iPads. What kind of cover or what kind of protective outside is it going to need in order for that equipment to be stored? Is it going to need to be locked up somewhere, and what is that container going to be? So those are all things that come into play. Materials and supplies. Are you going to need office supplies or printing costs or software? And again, that storage of equipment, that can come under that, as well as you can put it under equipment, because it's all direct costs, or you could put it under materials and supplies. Another line item they'll ask for in a budget is going to be contracted services. Are you going to have any outside consultants that come in and do some professional development? Are they going to maybe come in and perform, do some services like classroom lessons? Or are they going to, are you going to have someone who develops some materials for you? It's a legitimate cost, but you have to know what that cost will be, and you have to write in the contracted services, whether they're for the students, transportation is a contracted services? Are you going to have buses that take students to places? I used to direct a fine arts program at one time, and that was a huge cost in our budget, was transportation to and from the events. In that case, we also had things like musical repair, instrument repair. So those are all things that you have to think ahead, like what would it take to manage this particular grant? What would be the costs, and what do I want the grant funds to pay for? So if you have any questions, I'm assuming you're asking them out there, because I'll be happy to talk about any of these budget items. I'm going through them pretty quickly. Another thing that you will also have in a budget worksheet is something that's going to ask for indirect costs. These are expenses that are needed to operate the grant, but they're not necessarily just for the grant. For example, you're not going to charge a grant for the fact that you're going to have IT services in a school district. You'll have to figure out what the portion of IT services are that would actually be used in that grant. So you wouldn't charge a grant for all of the IT services for the district, but you might charge against a grant for the services just for the operation to meet the objectives of your grant. If you have any shipping costs or mailing costs or any of those are indirect costs. Now, the reason they're indirect is they're not necessarily direct services to the students or to the grant, but indirectly you're going to have those things. You're going to have possibly what Jen talked about, some grants, and many more are asking for these kinds of things nowadays. You're going to have what we call outside contributions, or they might call them matching or in-kind resources that are provided by partners, volunteers, even your organization. Suppose, as Jen said, suppose you do have volunteers that come in and work with this hypothetical after-school program that we're talking about. That you can assess the amount of outside contributions by assessing what the hourly rate of those volunteers would be, and then turning that in as a contribution or an in-kind resource for the grant. That is a very popular thing now for federal grants to do. They will ask for some of them ask for 100%. They will ask for, if you get a $100,000 grant, they will ask for 100% of in-kind or matching resources, and you have to figure out a way to do that. TI is a great partner in that effort. TI is an excellent partner for in-kind or resources, because sometimes they will donate the software that goes with equipment. They do a lot of different things, and Jen can talk more about the kinds of in-kind services that TI offers. But just remember that if that is a requirement, if the matching or in-kind is a requirement for a grant, be sure before you begin writing a grant like that you have spoken to administration and the accounting office, and if it's at a university, you've spoken to them about it. How are we going to make that match? How are we going to show? It doesn't necessarily have to be in real dollars, but it has to be in services and in-kind resources. They might volunteer meeting rooms, or they might volunteer some transportation costs. And before you write a grant and ask for X number of dollars in funding, be sure to think about, now how are we going to match that, or what are we going to do to meet that $100,000 amount that we've asked for.
Just to add to what Doris was saying, when it comes to match, lots of different things can apply. For example, your volunteers' time planning and preparing for the activity, that time can go into being matched. Their mileage, any costs that they have related to the program can be done up for match. Then there's also the percentage of match. Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it can be 10%, and then there'll be percentages, like if you're looking at the salary, for example. A volunteer's salary is going to be career dependent, and there's a certain dollar value that they provide for that per hour, and then it may or may not include a percentage of fringe benefits, and you'll need to know what that amount is. Something else I wanted to add in, for indirect costs, oftentimes you use a percentage to calculate that based off of the direct cost. For example, with the federal government, it can be anywhere from 2% to 8% of what you spend in direct costs that you can use to calculate those indirect costs. But you have to know what that percentage is for the different organizations so that you are not calculating at a rate higher than what is allowed.
And usually a grant proposal will spell out the maximum amount of indirect costs. And that's a really good point, Jen, and I wish I'd made that earlier. Sometimes if you're writing a grant for a school district, some school districts will have a really low indirect cost, and some will have a higher one. Usually for federal grants, 8.5%. And that means 8.5% of the total budget amount that you're asking for would go directly to the district to cover the services like phone service and equipment needs and IT and those other things. And that's a legitimate use of that money because, you know, they know that you can't operate without those things. So just when you write a grant, you know, just figure out what that is going to be up front so you'll know what, I always say, then you'll know what amount of money you have really to work with. All right, so I'm going to go on here, and I'm going to talk about a sample budget for a proposal for an enrichment program. Remember I told you we're going to have these this Einstein's pups that are going to come in and you know, attend these after-school tutorials 3 times a week, and hopefully that's going to encourage kids to, you know, be more excited about the process and get more kids there that are interested. And so anyway, I've developed like this sample budget, and it's going to illustrate information that's typically called for in most proposals. And so the funding agency, Show Me the Money, it's obviously made up, in this case is going to be committing some funds, and there are some funds that are committed from other sources. So in other words, you're going to you're asking for money from this agency, and you also, though, have some funds that are coming from other sources. So you're not asking for 100% of the operational costs to come from this grant. Always, when you are writing a grant, they will spend an incredible amount of time in any grant telling you how to develop the budget, and then they will ask for also a lot of times a budget narrative. So you will have a cost sheet on a budget that you will put in the numbers and the amounts, and you'll calculate that across the board and total it up. But they might also ask you to show a commitment of money that you're getting, or funds or resources from other sources. So I just want to make sure that you know that that might be in your proposal too. A lot of times a funder, a grant donor, will want to know that they're happy to give a certain amount of money, but they also want to know that someone else or somewhere else you're getting some committed funds, and you're not just depending entirely on the grant funds, but there's another source or another way that you're getting funds, so that they know that, like, okay, you know, one of the things we can think about in the future is when the grant funds are gone, they can begin, a district or a classroom or an institution will begin to think, okay, now we're going to have to start, we know we're going to lose these grant funds after 2-3 years. How can we start moving toward funding that on our own at that time? So anyway, it's a really good idea to always be able to show that you have some committed funds from other sources. You're going to follow whatever format. In any grant, you are going to follow whatever format you find in that application. That is one of the things that they will immediately, you know, put your grant down or put it aside and not complete it or read it if it's not in the format that they suggest. And if you've been with us in the last 2 portions of this grant writing webinars, we've talked about that they're very, very picky about things being in the right format, even in the right font size. Be sure monies are in the right categories. And so those are all things, we're just telling you literally from learning it the hard way. It just has to be just what they ask for in the application. If they don't see that specific format, if you don't see a specific format, then I'm going to give you one. I can give you one. We can always send you additional information, guides for developing budgets, sample templates for budgets. So if you're undecided and they do not specify a format, believe me, we can send several proposals as ideas to you. And remember, this is the most important thing. The budget tells a story just like your narrative tells a story about your proposal. It tells the funders that this is how we're going to spend the money because these are the things that we're hoping to do. And so if I started out and said your budget can be just as telling as any narrative that you want to write. Before I go to the sample budget, I will say this about writing grants. generally, when I sit down with a group of people and they have a great idea and we've found some funding and we're ready to start on a proposal, on an application, we just sort of brainstorm again some of the types of things that we think that we would need to spend that money on. And we do that right after we've got the idea, right after we've written the goal, right after they've told me what they hope to accomplish and we have some objectives. Then I'll say, and let's jump over here to budget. And they'll say, well, you know, budget, that's at the end of the application. And I'll say, no, you know what, we're going to move it up here to closer to, you know, our beginning stages, because we need to be clear in our mind just exactly what we can accomplish in this grant and how we can pay for it with this budget. And when you do that, when you go through that and you look at that budget and you start putting the money figures in there and seeing, you know, how far the money will go or not how far the money will go, then it becomes clearer about being able to go back and look at your narrative and adjust it to fit what you really will be able to do with that amount of money. So I'm just telling you from experience that the budget is a super important part of any project proposal. So I'm going to have to, Jen, if you have anything you want to chat about, that's fine. I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint right quick and go to this little sample budget that I've developed and show you what I'm kind of talking about here, so it won't be so nebulous as to what I'm saying.
I was just going to add that when it comes to equipment, to remember that equipment is typically large items. Oftentimes things like calculators will actually fall under supplies and materials, depending on how the grant itself categorizes equipment. Federal grants, it's typically things over $5,000. And for other grants, equipment can be the calculator or an iPad or any of those other smaller items. I also wanted to just add one little piece about when we talk about match. There's match and there's in-kind. Some grants will ask for match, which can be a dollar for dollar value. In other words, they're not looking for in-kind, which would be the value of something donated in place of funds. Sometimes when they ask for match, they may be asking for an exact dollar amount. So in other words, they're going to give you $100,000 and you and your school have to provide $100,000. Sometimes it may be only a percentage of that. They give you $100,000, you have to come up with $10,000. But there is a difference and a distinction between actual match, which is usually a dollar for dollar type match, and in-kind, which is the value of whatever's contributed or donated. So you want to be clear as to whether a grant, if they're asking for any outside contribution, whether they're actually seeking a cash contribution to balance what they're providing or an in-kind contribution.
That's great. That's so much clearer than the way I said it. Thank you very much, Jen. That is perfect. I've got the sample budget for this after-school program. Okay, and we're going to look at a funding agency. They put a grant proposal out there, and it's called Show Me the Money, and we're interested in going after that. So this is our proposal. Remember, our goal was to increase that attendance and participation in the after-school program, and we wanted to raise it by 50% in 1 year. And so we are concerned that these kids aren't coming. We don't know if it's like they're not interested or they don't feel comfortable. And, you know, sometimes kids are stressed out of something that they think, oh, my gosh, this is something, I'm not sure if I want to do this. And other kids have not said anything that made me think I really want to show up there. So we're going to do something that hopefully improves the participation by improving the confidence of the students that are there. So So here's our proposal in a nutshell. We've got this group, an outside group, a community group called Einstein's Pups, and they have been going into classrooms, and these dogs are trained companion dogs, and they will sit by kids as they're reading, or they sit by kids as they're doing math, or they sometimes are just in the classroom there as you know, just kind of a comfort level. Anyway, this is an innovative program that we're going to try, and we're going to propose to do it in grades 5 through 8. And these companion dogs are going to provide support to these kids in these after-school programs because, you know, that's a little bit looser situation in the after-school programs, and we want them to feel, you know, like there's something different about it than maybe they've experienced in other places. We're going to do it at 3 different campuses in this certain ISD. And the after-school tutoring program is already provided by the district. So we're not asking the grant people, we're not asking for this grant to fund the after-school program. We're asking for it to fund 3 days with the Einstein's Pups that come to the classroom. It's a local nonprofit group. It currently operates in several classrooms in the district, and it helps kids who are struggling in academics and who have social issues. And so that happens, you know, that happens to be something that this group, this Einstein's Pups, actually does anyway when they go into other classrooms. So we're proposing to send them 3 days a week to this after-school program. It seeks to award funds to the Einstein's Pups for the expansion of the program into an after-school program at grades 5 and 8, and several of the students in the after-school program are experiencing some emotional and social and motivational issues really due to outside the school problems, but it's transferring, as you know, if you're a teacher or you're in education, you know that comes to school with them. So those are problems that are showing up in that program. The Einstein's Pup is going to be a welcome addition, we hope, to small groups of students to learn some interactive social skills. Those are really amazing things that do happen. I've seen it happen with these companion dog programs. Hopefully it's going to increase motivation because kids want to come. They want to check on the dog, but they know the dog's checking on them. I know it sounds like, oh my gosh, could this work? But I've seen that happen actually. Increased motivation, and then a sense of responsibility because they'll be given some things to do in that program as far as taking care of the, you know, participating in the taking care of the dogs and being there and attendance and everything else. So this is our proposed budget for that Einstein's Pups that we want to add to our after-school program. And we've got a funder, a proposal out there, and we're going to write this, and hopefully we're going to get the funds for that. We'll put the date, obviously, that we're submitting this. So we've got a category over here, and the categories didn't break down into direct or indirect necessarily, except that they broke down into these line items. And one of the line items that the funder asked for was, are there going to be any salaries or wages paid out of these grant funds? And so what I've done is I've gone in here and I've said, well, yes, there's going to be 3 trainers, 3 days a week, one at each campus that we're going to serve in this program. And so 3 trainers, it's going to be $100 a day times 3 days a week times 30 weeks. There's 2-hour shifts that they'll be there each day. That's pretty good money. And so when you figure that out over the course of approximately 30 weeks that they're going to be working in the school year, the amount we're requesting is $9,000. We don't have any money from any other sources to pay toward these salaries and wages. So if we don't get the grant, we probably won't have the trainers. But for the project total, it'd be $9,000. So it's in salaries and wages only. So over here on the right-hand side, I've shown you, this will not be written on your grant, but I put it in red because this is a reminder. It's a good idea to put as much detail in the budget line item as you can so the funder knows why you're actually asking for that amount. So if you just put something like we need 3 trainers, one per campus, and said we want $9,000, it wouldn't be as clear as if you put we want 3 trainers, 3 days a week, 1 per campus, 30 weeks, and how many hours a day or a shift would be. So those things are helpful. It will really, really move your grant up to the top of the heap if you can give as much detail as allowed on the budget proposal forms. There's going to be no fringe benefits. We're not going to pay insurance. We're not going to be paying other costs. So I just left that with a 0. There is going to be some.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in.
All right.
I was just going to add the benefit of the detail that Doris is telling you about adding is also that when you are writing a description of what you're doing in your statement of need and describing your solution to it, your detail comes from your budget.
That's right.
So
it does.
How you explain your program is going to come from this budget because the budget is what informs what you write.
It absolutely does. And you know what? You will write a statement of need and put these things in, put these ideas in there, and then you're going to do a budget, and then they're going to ask you for a budget narrative, which is a several-page narrative of explaining the budget. And you think, well, you know, I just did the budget and I just explained it in my needs statement. But you know, the thing about a grant is you just keep telling them over and over again what it is you plan to do and how you plan to use it. And Jen is absolutely right. That needs to go in that place, and probably it will go in a couple of other places as well. So that you're going to add things like this one had a list for supplies. You're going to need any supplies. Well, because our classrooms don't have any dog dishes for the water for the dogs or the treats for the dogs, so we'll need those, and we'll need some rugs for the floor because we want to, you know, that's one of the requirements. And so I added those costs in there. All right. I added in that it'll probably cost $100 at each campus times 3 campuses, so that's $300 we're asking for from the grant. And then the food cost, the daily dog food and upkeep and all of those, that's already being paid. See, this is my column called committed from other sources. So this group of Einstein's dogs, they're already paying all of the costs for keeping these dogs up through the year. What you're asking for are a few additional items in this grant that would support this after-school program when those dogs are there, you know, the 3 days a week. Then another item on there is going to be travel, because you're going to those trainers that are bringing those dogs and the dogs are going to need mileage to and from the campuses 3 days a week, and we're figuring out that it's going to be 15 miles to and from those campuses. It could be different amounts. I just randomly chose that one. They're going to make 3 visits a week for 30 weeks. So you've got the 15 miles. Each of the 3 trainers is about that amount of mileage, 3 visits a week at approximately 54 cents a mile. I used a state rate for mileage. It comes out to about $60.50 a week and times 30 weeks. So it came out to about $729. You could round that off. It could be 800. You could put 800 there, or you could put 750 or something. But you could put a general figure. I put $729. We're not getting costs from anyone else for that mileage. No one else has committed any money toward it. So our total is $729. And then over here, I just put that that's the cost of 3 trainers, 3 visits for 30 weeks. I know this all gets a little tedious, but believe me, it's something that you really have to think through when you do one of these grants. There's other cost what I added, and that would be some additional liability insurance. The dogs are already covered for the days that they're in the regular classroom, and just to be on the safe side, the group decided that they might need to add additional liability insurance, and that would be about $500. Currently, there's about $2,000 worth of insurance coverage being paid by the organization, the Einstein's Pups organization. So you're just asking for the additional coverage for the days that the dogs will be there for the after-school program. And then your total expenses for this grant come out to about $13,379, which is, you know, you can round that off too and say 13.3 or 13.5, something like that. But I put in the exact amounts I put in the budget. And then what the $26,000 represents is those are the costs that are committed from other sources, meaning those are the costs that the Einstein's Pups organization, which is a nonprofit, is putting in. So, you know, really, they're getting a pretty good bargain here if you think about it. And so that's what you always want to show in a budget, is that there are commitments from other sources, and we're just asking for some additional funds to do some additional kinds of services that are not necessarily being covered now, but would be a great addition to our programs. Okay. Okay, so I'm back to the PowerPoint here, and Jen has given you a lot of really good advice, too, about the budget items. And I'm saying right now, you know, for us, all systems are good to go. And if you have any questions, sorry about that. If you have any questions, please submit those, and we will do our best to answer those. Perhaps there are some that have come in that we want to answer right now.
Yeah, Doris, Sherry had asked earlier, what if you created your budget, applied for the grants, and then you come across some unexpected costs? Is there a way to plan for those unexpected costs? So, for example, what if the price of the equipment needed increased since applying for the grant before you're able to purchase the equipment?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I'm going to do my best to answer that because it happens all the time. A lot of times when you are awarded a grant, that happens. And you will have a program officer or a contact back at the funding agency that gives you the grant. And you can amend and adjust those line items a certain percentage. And so you would contact your program officer or the contact person at the grant and tell them just exactly what you said. The cost is more, cost has gone up, or I need additional, we got more students enrolled and we need more equipment. And you can write an amendment to a budget. Sometimes you can, adjust some of those line items. Maybe you had too much in, maybe you had too much in contracted services and you need to move it to another line item. You can do that, but you almost always have to get permission to do it. I hope that makes sense. Any other questions?
We had a couple, but I think Jen took care of them.
Took care of them?
I believe.
Okay.
I believe so.
Okay. All right. Well, it has been it's been a fast and furious little budget session. We don't want you to be lost in space. We want you to have everything that you need as far as getting started on grants. So you've got Jen and our information there. You've got the Dropbox location on the PowerPoint, which has all of the documents and items that we've used in all of the sessions. And we're also really willing to help you when you're writing a grant and you have questions. We can't write the grant for you, but if we can point you in some directions and give you some moral support and some help along the way of what other people have done. So we hope you'll take advantage of this. TI is a really great company for making sure that you have all of the resources that you need in order to get started. And so I'm going to toss it now to Michael, who's going to talk to you about T-Cube. And I wanted to also remind you that we have a one-day grant writing session at T-Cube on March 1st. So if you're thinking about coming, we hope you'll come a day early and sit down with us and actually work out some real-life grant options. So, Michael, I'm tossing it to you. Thank you all very, very much. And thanks, Jen.
Doris, you did a fabulous job. I just wanted to add for the T-Cube pre-conference session, there should be, if you've already registered for it, there's going to be a confirmation email coming out because we definitely want to know exactly how many's there for material preparation. We're hoping that if possible that you can come bring a team because the goal is for you to leave there with sections already under development before you walk out the door.
That sounds great. So this is Mike again. So people can come to T-Cube to your one-day session, and actually if they have nothing started, they can actually start writing their grant, or if they've started, they can bring what they've started and have it kind of looked over, and you guys can offer suggestions.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thanks so much. So a couple things while we have a few minutes left to wrap up. I do want to share 2 things on our website that I think might be helpful. The first is, in case you missed the first 2 parts of our 3-part webinar series, to find the other 2 parts, one way to get there is under the Professional Development tab. You can scroll down to Online Learning, and then slide over to On Demand. And you can look through everyone that we have on demand, or you could select a topic like grant writing. And there you go. There are the 3 webinars listed. We're going to have 4 soon because we'll have this recording in a couple days. But there are 2 there that are the part 1 and part 2 of this series. The other thing I want to mention is under the Resources tab on our website. If you go under Funding and Research, one thing I noticed tonight as I was listening to Jen and Doris present is under the Research portion where it says Learn More. If you look through here, I think there's some really great research that's already been done that maybe you can use to support your grant. And again, this research is already done. It's available on our website. So please feel free to visit our website to learn more. So as Doris and Jen already mentioned, we're really excited that there's going to be a one-day grant writing session coming up on March 1st. Kind of like a pre-conference for the T-Cube International Conference coming up in San Antonio in just a few short weeks. We really hope you'll join us at that special one-day pre-conference and then stay for the rest of the conference as well. Earlier, Doris mentioned that tonight, one lucky winner is going to win a conference registration for 2 to this T-Cube International Conference, and tonight's lucky winner is Marjorie Gaskin. So Marjorie, congratulations. We really hope to see you as well as everyone else at the T-Cube International Conference. To receive a certificate of attendance, please click that link in the chat window. Also listed is a link for the documents that were used tonight by Doris and Jenny. If those links aren't working for you, feel free to just wait a couple days. You'll automatically get a follow-up email. In that follow-up email will be a link to the recording, as well as a link to the certificate and the documents as well. And if you're watching this on demand, go ahead and copy that link into your favorite browser to receive your certificate. Thank you so much, Jenny and Doris, for everything you shared. Again, not just tonight, but over the course of the past couple months in this 3-part grant writing webinar series. It was really nice to see this stretched out and not all just condensed into one short 60-minute webinar. So thanks so much for taking the time to share with us all of your expertise.
Thank you. It was fun.
And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you back online real soon. Have a great night.